Kyle Boges almost never trains to failure, which is strange because if you look at his strength and physique, you'd actually expect the opposite. Most lifters believe a set only counts if you push until the weight won't move anymore. But if you watch Kyle Boges' workouts carefully, you'll notice something different. He usually stops his sets with a couple of reps still left in the tank, and yet, he keeps getting stronger. His physique keeps improving. So either he's leaving gains on the table, or most lifters completely misunderstand how training to failure actually works. And that raises the real question. Is training to failure actually the best way to build muscle? Stimulus versus fatigue. According to Kyle Boges, a set taken to failure is probably maximally stimulating. In other words, it can create the strongest muscle-building signal you can get from a single set. But there's a trade-off. It's also maximally fatiguing. And that fatigue matters far more than most people realize. Because Kyle looks at the bigger picture. Effective training isn't just about how hard one set is. It's about how much productive work you can actually perform across an entire week. Think about it like this. You take your chin-ups to absolute failure. The last rep is slow, your grip is fried, and you barely get over the bar. In the moment, that set feels incredibly productive. But what happens to the next sets, and the next workout, and the session tomorrow? When fatigue gets too high, something important starts to drop: high-quality training volume. So instead of viewing training as one heroic set, Boges looks at the entire week. The real question becomes, how many times can you deliver a strong stimulus without burying yourself in fatigue? Here's the problem with going to failure all the time. If one brutal set ruins the next 3 sets, that max effort suddenly doesn't look so productive anymore. And you've probably felt this yourself. You destroy one set of pull-ups, and suddenly the rest of the workout feels terrible. And over time, that difference compounds. And once you understand this, the real reason K. Boges rarely trains to failure becomes obvious. Why he stops short of failure. Most of the time, he recommends stopping a few reps shy of failure. At first, that sounds like you're leaving gains on the table. But research, and plenty of real-world training experience, shows something quite interesting. When you train close to failure, you're still recruiting nearly all the muscle fibers required for growth, and the body still receives a strong signal to adapt. But the fatigue is dramatically lower, and that difference changes everything. Because when fatigue stays manageable, you can perform more high-quality sets, train movements more frequently, and recover faster between sessions. Now imagine repeating that for an entire week of training. Instead of one brutally exhausting effort, you accumulate a large amount of productive work over time. And that's why people who train this way often end up looking quietly strong, even though their workouts don't look extreme at all. In fact, if you watch K. Boges train, most of his sets look almost easy. But controlling fatigue won't just make training simple, it unlocks something much powerful: the ability to train the same movements far more often. And wait, this part is really important. Because if you get this wrong, you can train hard for months and barely make any progress. And that's the last thing we want if the goal is getting seriously jacked. The frequency advantage. Strength isn't just about how hard you can push one set. It's about how often your body gets the chance to practice producing force. And if that sounds strange, think about learning any skill. The more often you practice it, the better you get. And this is where K. Boges does something very different. Instead of treating exercises like dips as something you destroy once per week, he treats them more like a skill you practice regularly. Because every time you repeat a movement, your nervous system gets better at organizing it. Muscle fibers fire in better sequence. Stabilizers react faster. The movement becomes tighter, more efficient, and more controlled. Which is why 2 people can look almost identical, but one is dramatically stronger. But this only works if fatigue stays under control. If every session ends in total exhaustion, the reps slow down, and the quality of the work drops. Now compare that to someone who keeps their reps clean and stops just short of failure. They can train the movement again sooner, and when they do, the reps are still sharp. Over weeks and months, those extra high-quality repetitions add up to thousands of clean reps. But here's where things get really interesting. Avoiding failure isn't actually the only way to build muscle. Where failure training still makes sense. Now, this doesn't mean training to failure is useless. In fact, there's another style of training where it can work extremely well. And this is where a lot of people get confused. If your program uses lower overall volume, meaning fewer total sets, pushing those sets closer to failure becomes much more important. Because when you only perform a small number of sets, each one has to deliver a strong stimulus. In that situation, taking sets to failure can make perfect sense. So in reality, both approaches can work. So the real question isn't whether you should train to failure, it's how you structure your rest days. The real takeaway: this is where most people get stuck. They argue about which method is correct, when the truth is much simpler. Training to failure isn't magic. Avoiding failure isn't magic either. What matters is how the entire training system fits together. If your workouts involve high frequency, lots of sets, and consistent practice, managing fatigue becomes critical. That's why someone like Boges rarely pushes every set to the absolute limit. But if your program is built around fewer, harder sets, pushing closer to failure can be exactly what drives progress. So the real lesson, understanding when each approach actually makes sense. Because once you see that bigger picture, the whole debate suddenly becomes a lot less confusing. And the way you structure your own training might start to look very different. But once you see just how strong Boges actually is, this whole approach starts to make even more sense. I break that down in this video here.